The wind that swept down from the high plains of the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s did not care for property lines. It did not respect the barbed wire fences that were beginning to stitch the open range like crude surgical scars. Nor did it pause for the stone markers that men in suits drove into the hard red earth. It was a cold, indifferent force, carrying the scent of dust, drying sage, and the metallic tang of a storm brewing somewhere north of the Red River. In this corner of the frontier, there were two laws operating in uneasy parallel. First, there was the law of the town, kept in the land office in leather-bound ledgers. This law smelled of stale tobacco smoke, ink, and the wax of red seals. It was a law of maps drawn by men who had never walked the ground, a law of deeds and foreclosure notices, enforced by a sheriff who looked too often at his pocket watch and the railway schedules. This law said that land belonged to the man who held the paper. Second, there was the law of the water. This was the older law, the one the Comanche had known for generations before the first wagon wheel cracked the crust of the prairie. This law was simple and brutal. Life belonged to those who held the riverbank. Without the river, the grass died. Without the grass, the buffalo vanished and the cattle starved. Without the herds, the people perished. This law was not written in ink, but in the cracking mud of a drying creek bed and the desperate lowing of thirsty beasts. Clara Dunn lived in the fragile space between these two laws. She woke before the sun, as she always did, the chill of the cabin seeping through the thin quilt. The air inside the homestead was still, smelling faintly of wood ash and the medicinal sharp scent of the tonic she brewed for her father. Clara sat up, rubbing her arms. Her hands were not the soft, white hands of the ladies she saw in the catalogs at the general store. They were red and roughened by wind and work, the palms calloused from the handle of a hoe and the reins of a plow mule. She moved quietly across the rough-hewn floorboards, careful not to wake the man sleeping fitfully in the corner bed. She pulled her dress over her head. It was a simple garment, gray wool that had been turned and mended so many times it had lost its original weave. Near the hem, a patch of different fabric stood out, a square of flour sack cloth, bleached white, but still bearing the faint ghost of the milling company's logo. She did not care. Vanity had been the first thing to die out here, long before the crops failed. Clara knelt by the hearth, stirring the embers from the night before into a small flame to boil water for porridge. Her greatest fear was not the poverty that gnawed at the edges of their life. She was used to hunger. Hunger was just a dull ache in the belly that one could ignore with enough work. Her fear was the paper on the table. It was an eviction notice, or close enough to one. It spoke of boundary realignments and railway easements. It was the polite, legal way of saying that the Dunn homestead, specifically the access to the deep bend of the river, was too valuable for a dirt-poor girl and her dying father to keep. From the bed in the corner, a ragged cough shattered the morning silence. Jeremiah Dunn sounded like a man drowning in dry air. He sat up, clutching his chest, his face gray in the dim light. He had once been a man of iron, a pioneer who had driven stakes into this ground when the government claimed it was empty. Now, his heart was failing him, beating with the erratic rhythm of a broken clock. Clara was at his side in 2 strides, a cup of water in her hand. "Easy, Papa, easy now." Jeremiah drank, his hand trembling so hard the water sloshed over his knuckles. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and glared at the window, though the shutters were closed. "Did you hear them?" he wheezed, his voice a dry rattle. "Riders, in the night." "It was just the wind, Papa," Clara lied gently, smoothing the blanket over his legs. "Just the wind rattling the shingles." "It was Crow's men," Jeremiah spat, the name tasting like bile. "That devil in a silk vest, he thinks he can scare me off. He thinks because my ticker is bad, I will sign the paper and go die in a rooming house in the city." His eyes, faded blue but burning with a feverish intensity, locked onto Clara. "I am not leaving her. Clara, I am not leaving your mother out there under the willow tree. I promised her." "We aren't going anywhere," Clara said, her voice firm, though her stomach twisted. "Eat your porridge." Jeremiah Dunn hated the town. He hated the way it crept closer every year, bringing with it lawyers and bankers and men who measured the world in profit margins rather than bushels of corn. But mostly, he hated his own weakness. He looked at his daughter, seeing the fatigue etched around her eyes, a girl of 24 who looked 30, and the guilt sat heavy in his chest. Outside, the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the vast expanse of grass in hues of violent orange and bruised purple. Miles away, on a ridge overlooking the valley, a different kind of watcher sat atop a gray horse. Nate, known among his people as Greyhawk, did not move. He and the horse seemed carved from the same stone as the ridge. He was a man of perhaps 34 years, his face a map of the sun and wind, his dark hair bound back strictly. He wore the buckskins of his people, but they were worn and travel-stained, stripped of ceremonial beads. He was not here to dance. He was here to work. He looked down at the snake-like curve of the river. The water was low, the winter had been dry, and the spring rains had not come. In the camp to the west, the wells were turning to mud. The elders had spoken the night before, their voices grave around the fire. The treaty lines were lines on paper, they said, but water was life. The strip of land along the river bend, the place the white men called the Dunn Homestead, had been a watering place for the Comanche horses for 100 years before the first fence post was driven. Nate had been given a task. Go, the chief had said. Remind them of the agreement. We do not want their house. We do not want their cattle. We want the path to the water. If they deny us, then the paper law is broken, and we return to the old way. Nate touched the neck of his gray horse. He felt the weight of the debt he carried. He was a warrior who had seen enough blood to last 10 lifetimes. He had fought the cavalry in the 70s, watched friends die for hills that were now barren. He did not desire to kill. He possessed a cold, pragmatic discipline. Killing brought soldiers. Soldiers brought cannons. He wanted the water, not a war, But he also carried a deep, burning coal of anger, the anger of a man who has seen every promise made to him broken by men who signed their names with flourishes. He watched the smoke curl from the chimney of the small cabin below. They are awake, Nate whispered to the wind. He turned his horse, not towards the cabin, but back into the brush. He would not ride down yet. The sun must be high. He would ride in openly, not like a thief in the night. That was the Comanche way. That was his honor. But down in the town of Dust Creek, honor was a currency that had long since devalued. The town was waking up to the clatter of wagons and the whistle of the morning train. In the sheriff's office, the air was thick with the smell of old coffee. Sheriff Holt sat behind his desk, staring at a document that lay before him. It was a letter, typed on crisp, expensive stationery. The letterhead bore the discreet logo of a land development consortium. But everyone knew the hand behind it belonged to Silas Crow. Crow was not a gunman. He was a broker. He was a man who worked in the shadows of the railway expansion, a creature of the land office who knew exactly which palms to grease and which files to misplace. He did not carry a Colt revolver on his hip. He carried a rubber stamp and a pen. The sheriff rubbed his tired eyes. He was a man who had once been decent, but decency was hard to maintain when one owed gambling debts to the wrong people. He wants the survey markers moved again, Holt muttered to the empty room. He wants the Indian line pushed back. Crow's plan was elegant in its cruelty. If the markers were moved, the Comanche would believe the settlers were stealing their last access to the river. The Comanche would retaliate. The town would panic. The army would be called in to pacify the region. And, in the chaos, the Dunn family, stubborn, impoverished, holding the key piece of riverside real estate, would be swept away. Either the Indians would kill them, or they would flee in terror. Then, Silas Crow would buy the land for pennies on the dollar, and the railway would have its water depot. Holt looked out the window. He saw the doctor walking down the boardwalk, black bag in hand, heading toward the livery stable. Even the doctor knew Jeremiah Dunn was on borrowed time. Just a nudge, Crow had told the sheriff the night before, his voice smooth as oil. We just give the savages a reason to be angry, and we give the girl a reason to run. It is simply progress. "Sheriff, you cannot stop the train." The town was already buzzing with the poison Crow had dripped into its ear. At the general store, 2 women whispered as they chose fabric. "I heard the Comanche were seen near the ridge," one said, clutching her shawl tight. "They say they are painting their faces for war." "It is the Dunn girl," the other replied, sniffing disdainfully. "Her father is too sick to hold that land. It is a danger to us all. If the Indians attack that farm, they will burn the whole town next." The fear was palpable. It hung in the air like the dust, waiting for a spark. Back at the homestead, the morning chores began. Clara walked out to the small barn, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The landscape was vast and lonely, a sea of brown grass that stretched to the horizon. She fed the 2 mules and the single milk cow they had left. The animals were skittish, their ears swiveling towards the river. Clara patted the neck of the cow. "Hush now. It is all right." But she did not believe it. She felt eyes on her, not the eyes of a predator animal, but the heavy, calculating gaze of a human. She took the wooden bucket and walked down the path to the river. The Bermejo River, the Red River, ran sluggish and thick with silt. It was the lifeblood of this land. Her mother was buried on the rise overlooking this bend, under the weeping willow that was now bare of leaves. Clara filled the bucket, the water cold against her skin. As she straightened, something on the ground caught her eye. The grass near the water's edge was tall, usually swaying in the wind, but here, in a patch of mud near the cluster of river reeds, the grass was matted down. It was not the trampled chaos of a cow coming to drink. It was a distinct, heavy depression. She stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, pressed clearly into the red clay, was a boot print. It was a boot with a distinct, heavy heel, a riding boot. It was not her father's. His boots were old, the soles worn smooth and cracked. This print was sharp, the edges defined. Someone had stood here, perhaps for an hour, watching the house, watching her window. She looked up, scanning the opposite bank. The brush was thick, shadows pooling under the cottonwood trees. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold wind raced down her spine. Then she saw it. A few yards away, one of the wooden survey stakes, the ones with the red tips that marked their property line, had been pulled up. It lay on its side in the mud, like a fallen soldier, but a few feet further onto their land. A fresh hole had been dug, and the earth was packed down hard, as if someone had prepared to move the line in the dark of night. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that carried the scent of steel and dry earth. Clara gripped the handle of the bucket until her knuckles turned white. The threat was no longer a piece of paper on the table. It was here, in the mud. The riders her father had heard were real. She turned and walked back toward the house. Her steps hurried, the water splashing against her skirt. She did not know that on the ridge above, the Greyhawk was watching her retreat. She did not know that in the town. The sheriff was pouring a drink to steady his hand. She only knew that the fragile peace of the winter was over. The spring had come, but it had brought no flowers. It had brought only the promise of a storm. The river flowed on, indifferent to the lines men drew, indifferent to the girl running back to the dying man, indifferent to the warrior descending the ridge. But the silence of the morning was a lie. The fuse had been lit, and the flame was creeping toward the powder keg. The mist that clung to the river valley the following morning was not the gentle vapor of a spring dawn. It was a heavy, suffocating gray curtain that swallowed sound and blurred the edges of the world. It tasted of damp earth and the lingering, metallic chill of a winter that refused to fully release its grip on the Texas panhandle. Clara Dunn stood on the porch of the homestead, her hands wrapped around the wooden railing, the rough grain biting into her palms. She had not slept. The image of the boot print in the mud had played over and over in her mind like a looped melody on a broken piano. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of the dry grass, had sent her heart racing. She was waiting for the riders. She was waiting for the sheriff, or Silas Crow, or the men who left heavy footprints near her mother's grave. But when the figure finally emerged from the fog, It was none of these. He did not come with the jingle of spurs or the creak of saddle leather. He did not come with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a grain-fed horse bred for the plow or the carriage. The rider appeared as if he had materialized from the mist itself, silent and spectral. It was a single man on a gray pony. The horse was small, lean, and unshod, its hooves falling on the earth with a muffled softness that was unnerving. Clara reached for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. It was an old Spencer carbine, the metal pitted with rust, a relic her father had kept from days long past. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from a sudden, primal recognition. The rider was not from the town. He wore no hat. His hair was black and severe, pulled back, revealing a face that seemed carved from the same red sandstone that lined the canyon walls. He wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide, the fur turned inward, and leggings of buckskin that were dark with grease and travel. He sat his horse not with the stiff posture of a cavalryman, but with a fluid ease, as if his spine and the horse's spine were fused. It was the Comanche, the one the town whispered about, the one they called Greyhawk. Clara raised the rifle, but the barrel wavered. He was close now, perhaps 20 yards from the porch steps. He did not slow down because he had never been hurrying. He simply ceased forward motion, the gray pony stopping instantly at a subtle shift of his weight. He did not yell. He did not wave a tomahawk or scream a war cry. He simply sat there, his dark eyes moving in a slow, observant arc. He looked at the sagging roof of the barn. He looked at the thin cow shivering in the pen. He looked at the rifle in Clara's hands with an expression that was not fear, but a mild, weary disappointment. Clara lowered the gun slightly. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. "We have no money," Clara said. Her voice was thin in the heavy air. "If you have come to raid, you have wasted your ride." The warrior looked at her then. His eyes were hard, devoid of the wildness she had been taught to expect, but filled with a terrifying, disciplined intelligence. "I do not want your coin," Nate said. His English was clear, accented with a cadence that was slow and deliberate. "And I do not want your cattle." He gestured with one hand toward the river behind the house. "The water," Nate stated. It was not a question. It was a pronouncement. "The fences you have built cut the path. The river belongs to the earth. My people's horses are thirsty. The fences must move back from the bank." Clara stared at him. It was the same demand Silas Crow was making, but for a different reason. Crow wanted the land for the railroad. This man wanted it for survival. "We cannot move the fence," Clara said, her voice trembling. "If we move the fence, we lose the claim. The law says—" "The paper law," Nate interrupted. His voice did not rise, but it hardened. "I do not care for the paper law. The law of the grass is older. Move the fence, or we will cut it." Before Clara could answer, the door behind her burst open. Jeremiah Dunn stumbled out onto the porch. He was wearing his nightshirt, his gray hair wild, his face pale and slick with sweat. He dragged his bad leg, clutching the door frame for support, his other hand gripping his cane like a club. "Get off my land," Jeremiah roared. The sound was ragged, tearing from his throat. "You thieving heathen, I see you, I know what you are." "Papa, no." Clara dropped the rifle and grabbed his arm. "Papa, go back inside." Jeremiah shook her off with surprising strength. He stumbled down the single step onto the dirt, waving his cane at the mounted warrior. "I fought you 30 years ago. I buried good men because of you. You will not take this place. This is my home. You hear me, mine." Nate watched the old man with a detached coldness. He saw the way Jeremiah's chest heaved, the blue tint around his lips. He saw a warrior whose war was over, fighting a battle with his own failing body. "The land belongs to no one man," Nate said calmly. "It belongs to the wind and the rain. You are dying, old man. Do not spend your last breath on hate." "I will kill you!" Jeremiah screamed, breathless. He lunged forward, raising the cane, but his foot caught on a root. He pitched forward, gasping, his hand clutching his chest as a spasm of agony folded him in half. "Papa!" "Sssss," Clara screamed. She caught him before he hit the ground, her knees hitting the dirt hard. She struggled to hold his weight, her arms wrapping around his heaving chest. Jeremiah's eyes rolled back, his breath coming in shallow, terrifying rasps. Nate watched. He did not move to help, nor did he move to attack. He sat on his horse, a judge presiding over a tragedy. He touched the knife at his belt, a habit, a reflex of a man who expects every encounter to turn violent. Clara looked up. She saw the movement of his hand toward the knife. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. She thought he was going to finish what the heart attack had started. She thought he was going to slaughter them both right there in the dirt. Clara scrambled up, leaving her father gasping in the dust. She stepped between the fallen man and the horse. She spread her arms wide, making herself a shield. She was small against the backdrop of the vast prairie, a figure in a gray wool dress with a patch of flour sack on the hem, standing against a warrior who had survived a dozen winter campaigns. "Just spare him," she whispered. The wind snatched the words away, but Nate heard them. He stopped his hand. Clara took a step closer, right up to the shoulder of the gray pony. She looked up into Nate's face. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, hot and angry, but she did not wipe them away. She did not beg for her life. She negotiated for her father's. "He is old," Clara said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "He is sick. He cannot hurt you. If you need a price, if blood must be paid." She swallowed hard, the taste of bile in her throat. She looked at the knife at his belt, then up at his dark, unforgiving eyes. "Take me instead," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Nate stared down at her. He had expected her to run. He had expected her to shoot. He had expected her to weep and plead for mercy in the name of her God. He had not expected this. "Take you," Nate repeated slowly. "I am strong," Clara said, the words rushing out now, a torrent of desperate logic. "I can work. I can carry water. I can clean hides. I know the value of a life." She lifted her chin, exposing her throat, a gesture of submission that was somehow also an act of defiance. "Do not touch him. Take me. I will go. I will be your... whatever you need." It was not a cheap offer. Nate could see that. There was no seduction in her eyes, only a terrifying resolve. She was offering herself as a thrall, a hostage, a slave, to buy a few more months for the old man gasping in the dirt. Nate felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was not pity. Pity was a luxury for the white man. It was respect. He saw the same look in her eyes that he had seen in the eyes of the wolves when they were cornered, the willingness to tear out their own heart to protect the pack. He shifted in his saddle, leaning down slightly. "You offer yourself to a Comanche. You think we are monsters who steal women for sport." Clara trembled, her courage faltering under his intense gaze. She searched her mind, digging through the layers of fear for something, anything, that might reach him. She remembered the winter 3 years ago, the blizzard that had trapped a Comanche midwife in their barn. She remembered the soft, rhythmic sounds of the woman's voice as they waited out the storm, sharing a fire. Clara looked at Nate, and the foreign words felt heavy and strange on her tongue, but she forced them out. New haints," she stammered, the pronunciation clumsy, broken. Kani, sa, my friend, no blood, good." It was crude. It was the language of a child, but it was Comanche. Nate froze. The hostility in his posture evaporated, replaced by a sharp, stunned shock. He looked at this white woman, with her pale skin and her flour sack dress, speaking the tongue of the people. "Who taught you the words?" he asked, his voice quiet. "A woman," Clara whispered. "In the snow. She said we are all cold in the dark." Nate looked from her to the old man on the ground, then back to the river. He saw the desperation in her, the fierce, protective love that mirrored his own duty to his tribe. He realized he could not burn this house. He could not drive this woman away with violence. To do so would be to act without honor. She had offered the ultimate sacrifice, and in doing so, she had disarmed him more effectively than any regiment of soldiers. He straightened in the saddle. He took his hand away from his knife. "I do not trade in women," Nate said. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "And I do not kill the dying." Clara let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Her knees felt like water. "But the water must be shared," Nate continued, his tone brokering no argument. "My people are thirsty. I will not leave empty-handed." He gathered his reins. The gray pony danced sideways, sensing its rider's tension. "I will return when the sun goes down," Nate said. He pointed to the horizon, where the sun would dip below the canyon wall. "Have an answer for me. Not a trade, an answer. Open the fence, or we will ride through it." He turned the horse. He did not look back. He rode into the thinning mist, vanishing as silently as he had come. Clara collapsed beside her father. Papa, can you hear me?" Jeremiah was breathing easier now, the crisis passing, leaving him weak and shivering. "Did you shoot him?" he wheezed, his eyes unfocused. "Did you kill the devil?" "He is gone, Papa," Clara murmured, stroking his sweat-dampened hair. "He is gone." But as she knelt there in the dirt, the adrenaline fading into a cold dread, Clara heard a sound carried on the wind. It came from the ridge to the east, opposite where Nate had ridden. It was the sound of a horse shifting its weight, the clink of a metal bit, the clearing of a throat. Someone else had been watching. Nate had been honorable enough to ride in the open, but someone else had been hiding in the brush, watching the confrontation, watching her beg, watching the Comanche threaten the homestead. Crow's men. They had seen it all, and Clara knew, with a sinking certainty, that they would twist what they had seen. They would not tell the town that she had offered herself to save her father. They would say she was conspiring. They would say she was speaking their heathen tongue. She helped Jeremiah back into the house, half carrying him to his bed. He fell into a deep, exhausted sleep almost immediately. Clara went to the door to bolt it, her hands still shaking. As she pushed the heavy wood shut, her foot brushed against something lying on the floorboards. It was a piece of paper. It had been slid under the door while she was outside, or perhaps just before, while she was distracted by the mist. Clara picked it up. It was a formal document, the paper thick and creamy. Notice of eviction and seizure. It read in bold, black letters. It stated that due to unpaid liens and the new Railway Survey Acts of 1882, the property known as the Dunn claim was forfeit effective immediately. It claimed that Jeremiah Dunn had signed a surety bond 3 months ago using the land as collateral. Clara stared at the signature at the bottom. Jeremiah Dunn. She looked at her father's sleeping hands. They were gnarled with arthritis. He could barely hold a spoon, let alone sign his name with such fluid, sweeping loops. She brought the paper closer to her face. The smell hit her instantly. It did not smell like old paper from a file. It smelled sharp and chemical. It smelled of fresh ink. And the red wax seal in the corner was still tacky to the touch. This had not been mailed from a distant government office. This had been signed this morning, perhaps an hour ago, by a hand that was steady and cold. It was a forgery. A clumsy one. Arrogant in its haste. Silas Crow was not waiting for the Comanche to kill them. He was speeding up the timeline. He was squeezing them from both sides, the savages of the river and the law at the door. Clara looked out the window. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the fog, but the world felt darker than it had at dawn. "I will return when the sun goes down," Nate had said. She had 12 hours. 12 hours to save her father. 12 hours to solve a war. 12 hours before the hammer fell. Clara crumpled the forged eviction notice in her fist. She looked at the Spencer rifle leaning against the wall. She was not a warrior like the man on the gray horse. She was not a schemer like the man in the town. She was just a girl who knew how to grow corn in dry land. But as she looked at the false signature, a new feeling took root in her chest, right alongside the fear. It was a cold, hard anger. "You want the land?" she whispered to the empty room. "Come and take it." She smoothed the paper out on the table, picked up the rifle, and sat down to wait. The sun began its long arc across the sky, counting down the minutes to the sunset. The ride back to the Comanche encampment was a journey through a land that was slowly dying of thirst. Nate felt the ribcage of his gray pony moving beneath his legs, the animal's breathing slightly labored in the dry, thin air. The wind had shifted, blowing from the south now, carrying the heat of the scorched plains rather than the chill of the mountains. When Nate rode past the perimeter guards, no greeting was offered. The camp was situated in a box canyon where a natural spring usually trickled. But even that source was reduced to a muddy weep in the rock face. The hide lodges were gray with dust. Children sat in the shade, too lethargic to play games of stick and hoop. Nate dismounted near the central fire, where the council of elders waited. Before he could speak, a shadow fell across him. It was Red Wolf, a warrior 5 years younger than Nate. Red Wolf wore the paint of war on his chest, a stark streak of black ash. He looked at Nate's empty hands, then at the pony that carried no water skins and no trophies. "You return with nothing," Red Wolf said, his voice loud enough for the nearby families to hear. "The horses lick the damp stones for moisture. Greyhawk, did you find the river, or did the white man's fence turn you back?" Nate handed his reins to a boy and faced the younger man. "The river is there. The fence is there. The white man is old and dying." "Then he is easy to kill," Red Wolf sneered, stepping closer. "We should have ridden down at dawn. We should have burned the house and broken the dam they built for their cattle. Why do you hesitate? Have you lived among them so long you have forgotten the taste of victory?" Nate felt the old anger simmer, but he clamped down on it with the discipline that had kept him alive through the reservation wars. "Victory is not killing a sick man and a woman who speaks our tongue. That brings the soldiers. That brings the cannons from the fort. Do you want water for a day, Red Wolf, or do you want the river for the season?" He turned to the elders, ignoring the younger warrior's glare. "The woman asked for time. I gave her until sunset. If they do not open the fence, we will cut it. But we will do it with the sun at our backs, not as thieves. They will use the time to bring guns," an elder said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "They have no guns," Nate lied, though he remembered the Spencer carbine in the girl's hands. "They have only fear, but there are others watching, men from the town. If we strike the house, those men will say we are savages who slaughter the helpless. If we wait and simply take the water, we follow the law of the earth." Red Wolf spat on the ground near Nate's boot. "You talk like a lawyer for the white man. Tonight, if the water is not ours, I will lead the ride myself, and I will not ask for permission." Nate watched Red Wolf stalk away. He felt the fracture in his people as clearly as the cracks in the mud. Desperation was making them reckless. He sat by the fire, but his mind was back at the homestead, remembering the way the girl, Clara, had offered her own life to save her father. It was a debt of honor she was trying to pay, and that was a currency Nate understood better than any gold coin. While Nate battled the doubts of his kin, Clara Dunn was fighting a battle of a different kind in the town of Dust Creek. She had hitched the mule to their buckboard wagon, a rickety thing with a wobbling left wheel, and driven the 5 miles into town. She needed laudanum for her father's heart and flour for the week. Dust Creek was a collection of false-fronted wooden buildings clinging to the edge of the railroad tracks. As Clara guided the mule down the main street, she felt the atmosphere change. Usually, the town was indifferent to her poverty. Today, it was hostile. 2 women sweeping the boardwalk in front of the millinery shop stopped and leaned on their brooms. They did not whisper. They spoke in voices pitched to carry. "That is her," one said, her face pinched with self-righteousness. "The one who parleys with the savages? I heard she let them water their horses while decent Christian folks are scared to sleep." The other replied, "My husband says the Dunns are planning to sell the whole valley to the tribe just to spite the railway." Clara kept her eyes forward, her chin high, though her cheeks burned. The rumor was absurd. No one sold land to the Comanche. The government wouldn't recognize the deed, but logic had no place in a town gripped by fear. It was organized. This hatred. It had spread too fast, like a fire set at four corners of a field simultaneously. She tied the mule in front of the apothecary. When she entered, the shop was cool and smelled of dried herbs and camphor. The doctor was behind the counter, grinding powders in a mortar. He was a kind man usually, but today he would not meet her eyes. "I need a bottle for my father." "Doctor," Clara said, placing 2 coins on the counter. It was nearly all the money she had. The doctor hesitated. He looked out the window, then quickly slid a small amber bottle across the glass. "Take it, Clara, and take this advice. Keep Jeremiah inside." The mood in the saloon? "It is not good." "We have done nothing," Clara said, her voice tight. "Truth does not matter when men are frightened," the doctor replied softly. "And when there is money to be made from that fear." Clara took the bottle and walked out. The sun was high now, beating down on the street. As she reached for the mule's reins, a shadow blocked her path. "Miss Dunn, a pleasure, as always." Clara froze. She knew the voice. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. She turned to face Silas Crow. He was a man who looked like he belonged in a parlor in Boston, not a dusty street in Texas. He wore a charcoal suit that was impeccably brushed, a silk vest, and boots that shone with polish. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he walked with no limp. "Mr. Crow," Clara said, stepping back to put the mule between them. "I hear you had visitors this morning," Crow said, smiling. His teeth were very white. "A terrifying experience, I am sure. To be threatened in your own home." "We managed," Clara said. "For now." Crow nodded sympathetically. "But the Grey Riders will be back. You know that. They are like wolves. Miss Dunn, once they smell weakness, they do not stop." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded document. He held it out to her, not aggressively, but with the casual air of a man offering a handkerchief. "I can help you. Clara, I can have a dozen armed men at your fence line by sunset. The railway employs excellent security agents. They can ensure that no Comanche crosses the river." Clara looked at the paper. She didn't need to read it to know what it was. A quit-claim deed. "And the price for this protection?" she asked. "A simple signature," Crow said. "You sign the rights to the river access over to the consortium. We grant you and your father a lifetime lease on the house and the garden. You stay, you live in peace, and we handle the burden of defense." It sounded reasonable. To anyone else, it would sound like salvation, but Clara saw the glint in his eyes. He didn't care about her father. He didn't care about the Comanche. He wanted the water rights for the steam engines that would soon roll through the valley. "If I sign," Clara said slowly, "then the land is yours. And if the Comanche comes, then you will shoot them." "We will defend our property," Crow corrected gently, "with the full backing of the law." Clara realized then the full scope of his plan. He didn't just want the land, he wanted the war. If the Comanche attacked the railway property, the army would come, the tribe would be crushed or relocated, and Silas Crow would own everything from the ridge to the river. "My father will not sign," Clara said. "Your father is dying." "Clara," Crow said, his voice dropping to a murmur that was almost intimate. "Do not let his stubbornness be your obituary. Think of it. By tonight, you will be safe." "I would rather deal with the wolves," Clara said coldly. "At least they do not smile before they bite." She climbed into the wagon and snapped the reins. The mule jerked forward. Crow did not move. He stood in the street, watching her go. Clara saw him signal to the sheriff, who was leaning against the post of the jailhouse. The sheriff tipped his hat to Crow, a gesture of subservience that chilled Clara to the bone. The sun began its long descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The deadline Nate had given her was approaching. When Clara reached the homestead, the silence was heavy. She unhitched the mule and walked down toward the river to check the water level. The Bermejo was sluggish, the mud banks widening as the water receded. The drought was severe. She walked along the property line, checking the fence. That was when she saw it. The wooden stake with the red tip, the one she had seen lying on the ground that morning, had been hammered back in. But it was not in its original hole. Clara knelt, her heart pounding. The original hole was dry and crumbling, perhaps 10 feet closer to the water. The stake was now driven into the earth 10 feet further inland, onto their pasture. Someone had moved the line. It was a subtle shift. To a casual observer, it meant nothing, but to a surveyor, or to a Comanche who knew every inch of this bank, it changed everything. By moving the stake inland, Crow or his men had made it look like the Dunn family was claiming more land than they owned, pushing their claim aggressively away from the water and into the grazing path. It made the fence look like an illegal encroachment. It was bait. It was a deliberate provocation to make the Comanche believe the white settlers were greedy beyond measure. Clara stood up, looking at the distant ridge. The sun was touching the horizon. Night fell over the town of Dust Creek, but the heat did not dissipate. It hung in the alleyways, thick and stifling. Nate moved through the shadows behind the livery stable. He had left his pony a mile out of town, tied in a dry wash, and had covered the rest of the distance on foot. He wore a long duster coat he had taken from a scarecrow on an abandoned farm, hiding his buckskins, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He was a ghost in a town of the living. He moved with a silence that no white man could replicate, placing his feet carefully to avoid the creak of loose boards. He reached the back of the saloon. The windows were open to catch the breeze, and the sound of a piano and raucous laughter spilled out. Nate crouched beneath the window, peering through a crack in the siding. Silas Crow was sitting at a private table in the corner. Opposite him sat Sheriff Holt. There was a bottle of expensive whiskey between them. "The girl refused," Crow said, pouring a drink. He did not sound angry, merely bored. "She is stubborn, like the old man," Holt replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But the town is ready. I have 20 men deputized. They are just waiting for the signal." "No signal from us," Crow admonished softly. "We are the victims here. Sheriff, remember that. We wait for the savages to strike first. And they will. I had my boys adjust the survey lines this afternoon. When Greyhawk comes down tonight, he will see that the settlers have pushed their fence out. He is a proud man. He will not tolerate the insult." Nate felt a cold fury tighten his stomach. He had suspected a trap, but hearing it spoken with such casual disregard for life made his hand drift to his knife. "What if they don't fight?" Holt asked nervously. "What if they just talk?" Crow laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "Indians do not talk, Sheriff, and even if they do, well, paper has a way of catching fire. Just let them fight. Once the first shot is fired, the paperwork runs itself. The governor will sign the eviction order for public safety, and the railway gets the corridor." Crow slid a heavy leather pouch across the table. It clinked with the sound of gold coins. "Keep your deputies drunk and angry, Sheriff, and make sure when the shooting starts, nobody is looking too closely at who fires first." Nate pulled back into the shadows. He had heard enough. He slipped away from the saloon, moving through the alley toward the edge of town. His mind was racing. He hated the white man's world of ink and lies. He wanted to ride away, to take his people north, away from this poison. But there was nowhere left to go. The fences were everywhere, and he realized something else. The girl, Clara, was not the enemy. She was just another piece of livestock to men like Crow, something to be used and discarded. He reached the edge of town, where the darkness of the prairie began. He needed to get back to the homestead. He needed to stop Red Wolf from riding into a massacre, and he needed to tell the girl that her fence was now a trigger for a war she didn't understand. Clara sat on the porch, the rifle across her lap. The moon was a thin sliver, offering little light. The crickets were silent, which was a bad sign. She heard a sound, faint and crackling, coming from the north side of the property, near where the road from town met their fence line. It wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of consumption. Clara stood up, gripping the rifle. "Papa!" she called softly into the house, but there was no answer, The laudanum had put him into a deep sleep. She stepped off the porch and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering. As she crested the small rise near the barn, she saw it. A section of the split-rail fence was glowing. It wasn't a wildfire. It was a controlled burn. Someone had poured oil on 3 fence posts and set them alight. The fire was small, licking at the dry wood, casting dancing orange shadows on the grass. Clara ran to the horse trough, grabbed a bucket, and sprinted to the fence. She threw the water, the steam hissing violently. She ran back, refilled it, and threw it again. It took 4 trips to douse the flames, leaving her gasping for breath, her dress soaked and muddy. She stood there, shivering in the dark, smelling the acrid smoke. She looked down at the mud near the burned posts. There were no hoofprints this time, but stuck into the charred wood of the center post was a piece of paper, nailed there with a long iron tack. Clara pulled it free. It was a page torn from a Bible. She couldn't read the text in the dark, but she knew what it was. It was a message. I can do worse. The fire said, I can burn it all. She looked out into the darkness, toward the river. The deadline had passed. The sun was down. Nate said he would return. But as she stood by the smoking ruin of her fence, Clara realized that Nate was not the only one coming. The night felt crowded with invisible enemies. From the darkness of the riverbank, a coyote howled, a lonely, jagged sound. And for the first time in her life, Clara didn't know if the predator was the animal in the brush or the man in the silk vest sitting in the town saloon. She cycled the lever of the Spencer rifle, chambering around. The metallic clack-clack was the only answer she had left to give the world. The smell of charred wood still hung heavy in the air when Nate returned. He did not come with a war party. He emerged from the darkness alone, his pony stepping carefully over the blackened remains of the fence rail Clara had extinguished hours before. Clara stood her ground on the porch, the Spencer rifle in the crook of her arm. She was exhausted, her dress stained with mud and soot, strands of hair escaping her bun to stick to her damp forehead. Nate stopped his horse at the edge of the light cast by the lantern hanging from the eaves. He looked at the burned wood, then up at her. I told you I would return, Nate said. His voice was low, devoid of the threat that had been there in the morning. Someone else came first, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the fatigue. They left a message. Nate nodded once, slowly. I see. Fire is a coward's weapon when used in the dark. He dismounted. The movement was fluid, the grace of a man who lived half his life on the back of an animal. He did not move toward the house, but toward the path leading to the river. Show me the water, he said. It was not a command, nor was it a request. It was a statement of necessity. Clara hesitated. Her father was asleep, sedated by the medicine. The house was vulnerable, but she looked at the warrior standing in the moonlight, his hands open and empty, and she made a choice. She lowered the rifle, leaning it against the porch rail. Walk with me, she said. They walked side by side down the narrow path that cut through the tall grass. They did not touch, but the space between them was charged with a strange, vibrating tension. It was the awareness of 2 predators forced to share a cage. Clara was acutely aware of his height, the silent power in his stride, the way his head turned to scan every shadow. Nate was aware of her breathing, the scent of wood smoke and lavender soap that clung to her, and the surprising steel in her spine. At the riverbank, the moonlight turned the muddy water into a ribbon of sluggish silver. The level is low, Nate observed, crouching down to touch the damp earth, lower than the season of the falling leaves. It has been a dry winter, Clara said. She pointed to a large, weeping willow whose branches swept the ground near the water's edge. My mother is buried there. She loved this river. She said it sang to her. Nate looked at the grave, marked by a simple stone and a cross made of ironwood. My mother died in the snow, Nate said quietly. He did not look at Clara, but at the dark water. It was winter when the buffalo did not come. We boiled the leather of our moccasins for soup. I was a boy. I learned then that the earth does not care if we are good or bad. It only cares if we are strong. Clara looked at his profile. The sharp angle of his jaw softened slightly by the moonlight. It was the first time he had spoken of himself as a man, not just a representative of his tribe. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Do not be sorry," Nate said, standing up. "Be watchful." He moved past her, heading toward the dense brush that lined the northern bend of the creek. He moved with a purpose, tracking something she could not see. Clara followed, lifting her skirts to step over the tangle of roots. Nate stopped at a clearing near the water. He pointed to the ground. "Look," he said. Clara squinted. In the soft mud, there were boot prints. They were the same heavy-heeled prints she had seen earlier, but there was something else. A heavy canvas sack had been dragged through the mud, leaving a wide furrow, and near the edge of the water, where the brush was thickest, there was a spill of white crystals. Nate reached down, pinched a few grains, and tasted them. He spat immediately. "Salt," he said. The word was a curse. "Salt?" Clara asked, confused. "For the cattle?" "No," Nate said, his eyes darkening with a dangerous fury. "Rock salt. Too much for cattle. This is poison. Clara, if you put enough of this into the earth, nothing grows. If you dump it into the shallows where the water is still, it kills the fish. It kills the grass." He kicked the spilled pile, scattering it. "This is not how a man steals land. This is how a man kills it so no one else can have it. This is the tactic of the scorched earth." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Crow," she breathed. "He wants to ruin the water so you cannot use it, and he wants to blame us." "He leaves his tracks near your house," Nate said. "He burns your fence. He wants the Comanche to think you are the enemy, and he wants you to think we are monsters." He turned to her. They were standing very close now, enclosed by the willow branches and the dark brush. Clara looked up at him, and for a moment, the war outside ceased to exist. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the heavy burden of leadership he carried. He saw the terror she was holding back, the fierce determination to protect the dying old man in the cabin. "You offered yourself?" Nate said softly, his voice rough. "This morning, you said take me instead." Clara flushed, the memory of her desperation burning hot. "I meant it. I would do anything to save him." "It is a dangerous promise," Nate said. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder but not touching. The heat of his body radiated toward her. "Men like the one in the silk vest, if they know you have offered this, they will use it. They will say you have lied with the Comanche. They will paint you with the brush of shame to break your father's heart." "Let them talk," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "Words are just wind. Words start wars," Nate replied. "My people, the young ones, they think you are a trap. They think your offer was a trick to lure me into the range of a rifle." "And you?" Clara asked, holding his gaze. "What do you think?" Nate looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. The tension between them pulled tight. A physical ache. He wanted to reach out, to brush the soot from her cheek, but he held his hands at his sides, his discipline a wall of iron. "I think you are a woman who fights with no weapon," Nate said, "and that is the bravest thing I have seen." He stepped back, breaking the spell. "I will not cut your fence tonight, but I cannot stop the others forever. You must watch the water." "I will," Clara said. The next 2 days brought a slow, grinding escalation that felt like the tightening of a noose. Silas Crow did not hide his hand anymore. He sent a crew of 6 men to the homestead in broad daylight. They were surveyors, he claimed, though they wore pistols on their hips and chewed tobacco with menacing slowness. They moved the stone markers again. This time, they did not just move them a few feet, they moved the boundary line 50 yards inland, cutting off the Dunn homestead from the river entirely. Clara stood on the porch, screaming at them, waving the deed her father had kept in the tin box for 20 years. "This is illegal," she cried. "You cannot just move the line." The foreman, a man with a scar across his nose, just spat on the ground. "Map says different. Missy, new survey from the county seat. This is a railway easement now. You best keep your cows on your side." Sheriff Holt stood by his horse, watching. He did not intervene. When Clara ran to him, pleading, he looked away, adjusting his hat. "It is a civil matter, Clara," the sheriff mumbled. "If the survey says the line is there, the line is there. I cannot argue with the county." The town of Dust Creek watched, and the town divided. In the general store, the arguments were hushed but vicious. "It is theft, plain and simple," the blacksmith grumbled, slamming his hammer on the anvil. "Crow is stealing that girl's inheritance." "It is safe," the milliner argued back. "If the railway controls the river, the Indians won't come near. Crow is building a wall between us and the savages. Better the girl loses a few acres than we all lose our scalps." The division cut through the community like a knife. People crossed the street to avoid Clara when she came in for supplies. Others, like the schoolteacher and the doctor, tipped their hats with extra respect, a silent solidarity that offered little comfort against the looming threat. The breaking point came on the third night. The heat had been oppressive all day, a heavy, humid blanket that made the air hard to breathe. Jeremiah Dunn had been restless, his face gray, his breath coming in shallow wheezes. Clara sat by his bedside, fanning him with a folded newspaper. "The water," Jeremiah whispered, his eyes closed. "Is the water clear? Clara, it is clear. Papa," she lied. She hadn't told him about the salt. She hadn't told him about the moved markers. "Good," he sighed. "Good." Then his eyes snapped open. He gasped, a terrible wet sound, and clutched his chest. His body arched off the mattress, his face turning a terrifying shade of blue. "Papa!" Clara screamed. She fumbled for the medicine bottle, but his jaw was clamped shut. He was convulsing, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird. "Help!" Clara shrieked, running to the door. "Somebody help!" She ran out onto the porch, screaming into the darkness, but the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. The doctor was 5 miles away in town. By the time she hitched the mule, it would be too late. From the darkness of the road, a shadow detached itself. It was a horseman. Clara froze, terror gripping her. Was it Crow's men? Had they come to finish the job? But the horse was small and gray. Nate rode into the light. He had been watching. He had been patrolling the perimeter, keeping an eye on the salted ground, waiting for Crow to make another move. He heard the scream. He saw Clara on the porch, her face a mask of pure panic. "My father," she sobbed, abandoning all pride. "His heart, he is dying." Nate looked at the mule in the corral. It was old and slow. Then he looked at his pony. It was tiring, but it was Comanche bred. It could run until its heart burst. He did not hesitate. He slid from the saddle. "Take my horse," Nate said. Clara stared at him. "What?" "He is fast," Nate said. He grabbed the reins and shoved them into her hands. "Ride to the town. Bring the healer. Go!" Clara looked at the horse, then at Nate. He was giving her his mobility, his only means of escape, his most valuable possession. "Go!" Nate shouted, a command that brooked no argument. Clara scrambled onto the gray pony. It shied at her smell, at the skirts, but Nate held the bridle firm, whispering a sharp word in his tongue. The horse settled. Clara kicked its flanks, and the pony launched forward, tearing into the night like a gray thunderbolt. Nate stood alone on the porch of the enemy, guarding the dying man inside. The ride was a blur of wind and darkness. The Comanche pony was faster than anything Clara had ever ridden. It seemed to float over the ruts and holes in the road. She reached the town in record time, hammering on the doctor's door until he appeared in his nightshirt. "My father," she gasped. "Now." The doctor didn't ask questions. He grabbed his bag and his coat. They took his buggy, tying the gray pony to the back. When they returned to the homestead, the sun was just beginning to threaten the horizon. Nate was gone. He had vanished into the brush as soon as he heard the buggy wheels. The doctor worked on Jeremiah for an hour. It was close. The old man's heart had nearly given out entirely, but the medicine, administered just in time, slowed the erratic rhythm. "He will live," the doctor said, wiping his hands on a towel. But only just. Clara, he cannot take another shock. Any excitement, any fear, it will kill him. Clara nodded, sinking into the chair by the table. She was trembling with exhaustion. She looked around the room. On the table, amidst the clutter of medicine bottles and spoons, was the tin box where her father kept his papers. It had been knocked over in the panic, its contents spilled. Clara began to gather the papers. Deeds, receipts for seed, an old letter from her mother, and at the bottom of the pile, a yellowed, brittle sheet of paper caught her eye. It was an affidavit, dated 30 years ago, 1852. It was a statement given to the fort commander, signed by Jeremiah Dunn. I, Jeremiah Dunn, do hereby attest that I found the boy child wandering in the blizzard near the Antelope Hills. He was half frozen and starving. I provided him with shelter and food for 3 days until his kin could be located. The boy gave his name as Greyhawk. Clara stared at the paper. Her breath caught in her throat. 30 years ago, her father had been a young man, a scout for the army. Nate would have been a child, no more than 3 or 4. Jeremiah hated the Comanche now. He called them savages and thieves. But 30 years ago, in the midst of a storm, he had saved one, and that one was the man who had just given his horse to save Jeremiah's life. They were not strangers. They were bound by a thread of mercy that stretched back decades, a debt that had been paid and repaid in the dark, miles away, in the Box Canyon. Nate stood before the council. The sun was up now. The camp was awake. "You gave your horse to the white woman?" the chief asked. His face was unreadable, lined like ancient bark. Red Wolf laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "He is a servant to them now. He runs their errands. He walks on foot while the enemy rides his war pony." Nate stood tall. He did not look at Red Wolf. He looked only at the chief. "The man was dying," Nate said. "He is an enemy," Red Wolf shouted. "Let him die, one less rifle to point at us." "I did not save him because he is a friend," Nate said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I saved him because his death is what the snake wants." "The snake?" the chief asked. "The man Crow," Nate said. "He poisons the water with salt. He moves the stones. He wants the old man dead so the girl will flee. If the girl flees, the railway takes the land. If the railway takes the land, the wire goes up, and we never drink from that river again." He stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "I fight for the water. I do not fight for the convenience of a land broker. If I let the old man die by the broker's trick, then I am the broker's dog. I am no man's dog." The chief looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. "You have the long sight, Greyhawk, but the young men, they only see the fence. You must finish this soon, or I cannot hold them back." Clara sat on the porch, the old affidavit folded in her pocket. The doctor had gone. The morning was quiet, too quiet. The air smelled strange. It did not smell of morning dew. It smelled of sulfur and oil. Clara stood up, walking to the edge of the porch. She looked toward the river, to the irrigation trench her father had dug by hand 10 years ago. It was the artery that fed their small cornfield and the vegetable garden that kept them alive. The water in the trench was not brown. It was slick with a rainbow sheen. Oil. Someone had poured gallons of coal oil into the upstream gate of the trench. And then she saw the smoke. It was not coming from the house. It was coming from the small granary, a wooden shed where they kept the seed corn for the next planting. A tongue of flame licked up the side of the shed. Crow was done with threats. He was done with moving fences. He had moved to the final stage of his plan. He was burning them out. Clara ran toward the shed, grabbing a shovel, but she stopped halfway. Standing near the burning shed was a group of 3 riders. They were not wearing masks. They were watching the fire with the casual indifference of men watching a campfire. One of them saw her and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Dunn," he called out. "Looks like you have some bad luck. Indian trouble, I reckon." He pointed to the ground near the fire. There, planted in the earth, was a Comanche arrow. It was a prop, a fake, A clumsy piece of theater to blame Nate's people for the arson. Clara gripped the shovel until her hands bled. The oil in the water would kill the garden. The fire would take the seed. They had no food. They had no money. They had no water. Crow had backed them into a corner so tight there was no way out. Or so he thought. Clara looked at the fake arrow, then at the smirking rider. She felt the fear evaporate, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She turned and walked back to the house. She did not run. She walked with the steady, heavy step of a woman who has nothing left to lose. She went inside, past her sleeping father. She took the affidavit from her pocket and placed it on the table. Then she picked up the Spencer rifle and a box of ammunition. She walked out the back door, heading not toward the town, but toward the ridge, toward the smoke of the Comanche camp. If Silas Crow wanted a war, she would not give him the one he expected. She would not run to the sheriff. She would go to the only man who understood the language of the scorched earth. She was going to find Greyhawk, and this time, she wasn't going to ask him to spare anyone. The morning sun did not bring hope. It brought a blinding revelation of ruin. Clara stood at the edge of the irrigation trench, her eyes fixed on the field that had been their pride. It was the best acre they owned, the dark soil painstakingly cleared of stones and roots by her father's hands 10 years ago. Now, a long, jagged scar of white cut through the center of the furrows. It glistened in the harsh light like frost. But the air was sweltering. It was salt, bags of rock salt, meant for curing hides or preserving meat, had been slashed and dragged across the earth, then watered in with the poisoned contents of the trench. Jeremiah Dunn stumbled out of the house. The sedatives from the night before had worn off, leaving him brittle and shaking. He walked past Clara, dropping to his knees in the mud. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the white crystals. He brought his fingers to his nose, then to his tongue. He did not scream. He simply collapsed. It was as if the salt had leached the moisture and the life right out of his bones. He fell face forward into the poisoned dirt, his breath coming in jagged, terrifying gasps. "Papa!" Clara screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. She turned him over, wiping the mud from his gray face. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, filled with a despair so profound it looked like death. "They killed it," Jeremiah wheezed, his voice a dry rattle. "They killed the land." From the direction of the town road, the sound of hoofbeats thundered like a rolling storm. It was not the rhythmic trot of a single rider. It was a mob. Sheriff Holt rode at the front, his face pale and sweating. Behind him were 20 men from the town shopkeepers, laborers, drifters, all armed with shotguns and hunting rifles, and riding beside the sheriff, looking impeccable in a fresh coat despite the heat, was Silas Crow. "There!" a man shouted, pointing at the smoke still rising from the burned granary. "See, the savages burned the stores. They are trying to starve them out." The narrative had been set. The fake arrow, the fire, the Indian trouble, it had all been orchestrated to bring this hammer down. Clara stood up, her dress heavy with the salted mud. She looked at the mob. Then she looked toward the river. On the opposite bank, the Comanche had gathered. They had seen the dust of the approaching riders. They were outnumbered, perhaps 30 warriors, but they sat their ponies with lethal stillness. They had not come to raid. They had come because the water flow had stopped, blocked by the debris of the sabotage. The two forces faced each other across the narrow strip of the Bermejo River. The air was thick with the scent of violence. Then, a single figure rode out from the brush and stopped in the middle of the ford, the water swirling around his gray pony's hooves. It was Nate. He sat alone between the two armies. He held no weapon in his hands, though the knife was at his belt and a lance was strapped to his saddle. He looked at the sheriff, then he looked at the warriors behind him. He was the gatekeeper. He knew that if a single shot was fired, the river would run red, and the army would descend to wipe his people from the map. "Go back," Nate's voice carried over the water, deep and commanding. "There is no war here unless you bring it. Step aside, Greyhawk," Silas Crow shouted, riding forward slightly. "We are here to protect these settlers. We know what you did. We saw the fire. You saw what you lit." Nate replied, his eyes locking onto Crow. "He is lying," a man in the mob yelled, raising a shotgun. "Look at the girl! Look at the old man! They are dying in the dirt!" Clara saw the finger tightening on the trigger. She saw the younger Comanche warriors knocking arrows to their bowstrings. She ran. She left her father's side and ran toward the river, stumbling over the uneven ground, her lungs burning. "Stop!" Clara screamed. She forced herself between the mob and the river, standing on the bank, a frantic figure against the muddy water. "Stop it! It was not them!" She pointed a shaking finger at Silas Crow. "It was him!" she yelled, her voice cracking. "Crow! He burned the fence! He poisoned the trench! He wants the land for the railway!" The mob hesitated for a second, but Crow laughed. It was a dismissive, pitying sound. "The poor girl," Crow said loudly, addressing the crowd. "The fear has turned her mind. Or perhaps," he paused, his voice dropping to a sneer, "perhaps the rumors are true. She protects the savage because she lies with him." A murmur of disgust rippled through the men from the town. The accusation, vile and calculated, stripped Clara of her credibility in an instant. To them, she was no longer a victim. She was a collaborator. "Move aside, girl," the sheriff said, though he looked sick. "We have to secure the river." Nate watched this. He saw the girl standing alone, her truth crushed by the weight of prejudice. He saw the gleam of triumph in Crow's eyes. He realized then that honor meant nothing to men who fought with ink and lies. If he stayed on his horse, there would be a massacre. If he fought with a lance, he would be just another savage to be put down. He had to fight by their rules. Nate slid from his pony. He splashed through the shallow water, moving toward the bank where the townspeople stood. "He is charging!" someone shouted. Nate did not draw a weapon. He walked straight toward the sheriff, his hands open but his body coiled like a panther. The mob parted instinctively, unnerved by his sheer, silent confidence. "Sheriff," Nate said, stopping 10 feet from the lawman. "You are a man of the law. Do you arrest men for crimes they did not commit?" I have evidence," Holt stammered, gesturing to the burned shed. "You have a fire," Nate said. "I have the man who lit it." Before anyone could react, Nate moved. He did not lunge at the sheriff. He lunged past him. He moved with a speed that blurred the eye. He grabbed the bridle of Silas Crow's horse, jerking the animal's head down. As the horse reared, Crow lost his balance. Nate reached up, grabbed the lapel of the expensive charcoal suit, and ripped the broker from the saddle. Crow hit the dust with a heavy thud. "Get him!" Crow screamed, scrambling backward. "Kill him!" 3 of Crow's hired riders, the men who had burned the fence, jumped forward. They were big men, brawlers who relied on weight and intimidation. Nate did not panic. He did not reach for his knife. He used the ground. As the first man swung a heavy fist, Nate ducked under the blow, drove his shoulder into the man's solar plexus, and swept his legs. The rider hit the ground with the sound of breaking wind. The second man tried to draw a pistol. Nate stepped inside his guard, trapped the gun hand against the man's own chest, and twisted the wrist. There was a sharp crack of bone. The man screamed and dropped the gun. Nate shoved him into the third attacker, sending them both tangling into the dirt. It was over in 10 seconds. Nate stood over Silas Crow, his breathing even. He had not spilled a drop of blood. He had simply dismantled the violence with superior discipline. He reached down, grabbed Crow by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. He dragged the man toward the sheriff, forcing him to his knees in the salted mud. "Ah, look at his boots," Nate commanded the sheriff. Holt looked down. Crow's boots were expensive, with a distinct, heavy heel. "Look at the prints in the mud," Nate said, pointing to the track leading from the poisoned trench. "They are the same." "A boot is a boot," Crow spat, trying to struggle, but Nate's grip was iron. "This proves nothing." "Sheriff," Clara's voice rang out. She was running back from the house, clutching a piece of paper. She thrust the forged eviction notice at Holt. "Look at the seal," Clara demanded. Smell the wax. It was signed yesterday, but the date is 3 months ago. And look at the signature. My father's hand shakes so much he cannot hold a spoon. This signature is perfect. It is a forgery." The sheriff took the paper. He looked at the signature, then at the date. He looked at Crow, who was now sweating profusely. "And ask him." A voice came from the back of the crowd. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who ran the boarding house in town. She had ridden out with the mob, driving her own wagon. She stepped down, her face stern. "He paid me $50 to tell people the girl was selling the land, Mrs., Gable said, pointing at Crow. "He said it was for the good of the town. But a lie is a lie, Silas, and I will not have my soul stained by it." The mood of the mob changed. It did not turn like a tide. It snapped like a dry branch. These men were farmers, shopkeepers, people who scraped a living from the hard earth. They feared the Comanche, yes, but they hated a land grabber with a burning passion. They knew what it was like to be squeezed by the banks and the railways. The shotguns were lowered. The eyes that had been fixed on Nate now turned to the man in the silk vest. "Is it true, Silas?" the blacksmith asked. Stepping forward, "Did you salt the land? Did you poison a man's crop just to steal it?" Crow looked around. He saw the disgust on their faces. He realized his charm had run out. His mask slipped, revealing the arrogant, calculating creature beneath. "Steal it," Crow laughed, hysterical and shrill. "I was saving it. Do you think this land belongs to these dirt scratchers? Do you think it belongs to the savages?" He struggled against Nate's grip, shouting into the faces of the crowd. "It belongs to the future. The railway is coming. They need this water. They need a depot. If we give it to them, this town becomes a city. We all get rich, but no. You want to protect a dying old man and a girl who plays squaw. So you wanted a war," Nate said, his voice cold. "You wanted the army to come and kill my people so you could have your train station." "I wanted progress," Crow screamed. "And the paper says I am right." "The paper says." "The paper is a lie," Nate said. He shoved Crow forward. The sheriff caught him. Holt looked at the man he had taken bribes from. He looked at the salted field. He looked at Clara, who was kneeling in the dirt again, weeping over her father. Holt made a choice. He pulled the handcuffs from his belt. "Silas Crow," Holt said, his voice heavy. "You are under arrest for forgery, arson, and incitement to violence. You cannot do this," Crow sputtered as the cuffs clicked. "I represent the consortium. I will have your badge." "Maybe," Holt said, "but you will not have this land." The mob watched in silence as the sheriff shoved Crow toward his horse. The riders who had attacked Nate were scrambling into the brush, fleeing now that their paymaster was in chains. Nate stood alone in the center of the clearing. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired. He turned to look at the Comanche across the river. The warriors lowered their bows. They had seen the fight. They had seen Greyhawk take the white man down without drawing a blade. They saw the justice of it. They turned their ponies and rode back into the trees, vanishing as silently as smoke. But the victory was hollow. Clara sat in the mud, rocking her father. Jeremiah was alive, but he was broken. The field around them the best acre. The heart of the farm was dead. The salt shone white in the sun, a permanent scar that no rain would wash away. Nate walked over to Clara. He looked at the white crystals. He knew what this meant. Nothing would grow here for a generation. The land had been saved from the bank, but it had been killed by the broker. "He is gone," Nate said softly. Clara looked up. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt. She looked at Nate, and in her eyes, he saw a change. The girl who had offered herself to save her father was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the worst of the world and survived it. "The land is dead," Clara whispered. "Only this part," Nate said. He crouched down, picking up a handful of the poisoned land. He let it sift through his fingers. "The river still flows. The rest of the grass still lives." He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "You must choose now. Clara, the town will remember this. Some will say you were right. Others will still hate you because you stood with me. You can leave. Pack your wagon and go where the soil is sweet." Clara looked at her father, then at the grave under the willow tree. She looked at the burned fence and the salted furrow. "No," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the strength of ironwood. "This is my home. I do not run." Nate nodded. It was the answer he had hoped for, and the answer he had feared. He stood up. He felt the gaze of the townspeople on him. They were not attacking, but they were not welcoming. He was an outsider who had exposed their foolishness. He had humiliated a powerful white man. They would not forgive him for that quickly, and he knew his own people would be wary. He had fought for the white man's law today. He had chosen a side. "I will help you carry him inside," Nate said. Together, they raised Jeremiah Dunn. They carried him past the sheriff, past the staring crowd, past the salted earth, and back into the small, dark cabin. Outside, the wind began to blow, kicking up dust and grit. It swirled over the boot prints and the tire tracks, over the bloodless battlefield. The climax had passed. The gun had not been fired, but the world had changed. The lines had been drawn not in ink, but in trust and salt, and they would never be erased. The days that followed the arrest of Silas Crow were not marked by celebration. There were no parades in the town of Dust Creek. There were no victory dances in the Comanche camp. There was only the silence of exhaustion and the heavy, grinding reality of the work that remained. The salt was the first enemy. It lay upon the earth like a shroud of white frost, mocking the heat of the sun. It had choked the life from the best acre of the homestead. If left alone, it would leach deeper, poisoning the water table itself. Nate and Clara attacked it with the desperation of surgeons trying to excise a rot. They worked from the moment the sun crested the horizon until the light failed them. Nate stripped off his heavy buffalo coat, working in his buckskin shirt, the muscles of his back bunching and releasing as he swung the pickaxe. He broke the hard crust of the salted earth, shattering the poisoned clods. Clara followed him with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. She scraped the contaminated topsoil away, loading it pile by heavy pile, and wheeled it to a barren ravine far from the water source. It was back-breaking labor. Her hands, already calloused, blistered and bled. Her back ached with a constant, dull throb. But she did not stop. They moved together with a rhythm that required no words. Nate would strike, stepping back, and Clara would scoop. When the wheelbarrow was full, Nate would take the handles without asking. His greater strength needed to push the load up the incline, while Clara took the pickaxe to loosen the next patch. It was a dance of survival. There was an intimacy in the sweat and the dirt that was far more profound than any conversation in a parlor. They smelled of wet earth, salt, and labor. They shared the same canteen of tepid water, passing it back and forth, their fingers brushing against the tin. For 3 days, they fought the land to save the land. On the 4th day, they turned the water back on. Nate had cleared the debris from the upstream gate, washing away the oil residue with sand and focused currents. When the clear water of the Bermejo finally rushed back into the trench, bypassing the salted scar and flowing toward the healthy soil near the house, Clara sat down in the mud and wept. She did not weep from sadness. She wept from relief. Nate stood over her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that his shadow shielded her from the sun. "The earth heals," Nate said quietly, "but it leaves a scar. The corn will not grow in the white patch this year. Maybe not for 10 years, but the rest will live." Clara wiped her face with her apron. She looked up at him. His face was streaked with mud, his hair loose from its tie. He looked wild and dangerous, yet he was the only thing standing between her and oblivion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me," Nate replied, looking toward the horizon. "We are not done." The town remained distant. Sheriff Holt rode out once, looking sheepish, to report that Crow was being held for the circuit judge. He brought a sack of flour as a peace offering. Clara took it, but she did not invite him in for coffee. The betrayal of the townspeople, their readiness to believe the worst of her, sat like a stone in her chest. Nate faced a colder reception. He rode to the edge of the Comanche camp one evening to trade for fresh meat. Red Wolf stood at the perimeter, his arms crossed. "You smell of the white man's plow." Red Wolf sneered. "You dig in the dirt like a woman. You fight their battles with their sheriff. Are you Comanche, Greyhawk, or are you a farm dog?" "I secured the water," Nate said calmly. "The ponies drink. The women do not walk 3 miles to the muddy well. That is what matters." "The people talk," Red Wolf warned. "They say you stay at the homestead not for the water, but for the white woman. They say she has bewitched you." Nate did not answer. He took the venison he had traded for and turned his pony. He knew the cost of his position. He was standing on the bridge between 2 worlds, and both sides were eager to burn it down. That night, the air turned cold. The wind swept down from the north, carrying a bite that belied the season. In the cabin, Jeremiah Dunn sat in his rocking chair by the hearth. He was weak, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were clear. He watched Nate enter the room, carrying an armful of firewood. It was the first time Jeremiah had truly looked at the warrior since the day of the confrontation. Before, he had seen only a savage, a threat, a ghost from the past wars. Now, he watched the way Nate moved, the care he took not to let the heavy logs bang against the floorboards. "You handle that wood like you are afraid of waking a baby," Jeremiah rasped. Nate paused, placing the wood on the hearth. "Silence is a habit, old man. Noise tells the enemy where you are." "I used to think you were the enemy," Jeremiah said. He coughed, a dry sound, but he waved away the water Clara offered. "I saw you stand in front of the sheriff. You could have killed Crow. You had him dead to rights. Why didn't you?" "Because then I would be what he said I was," Nate replied, kneeling to stoke the fire. "And because your daughter needed the truth more than she needed a corpse." Jeremiah looked at Clara, who was mending a shirt by the lantern light. He saw the way her eyes lingered on Nate's back. He saw the strength in her shoulders that matched the warrior's. "You have a debt to me," Jeremiah grumbled, shifting in his chair. "From 30 years ago, in the snow." "I remember," Nate said. "The debt is why I am here. But the debt is nearly paid." "Maybe," Jeremiah muttered, closing his eyes. "Maybe." Later that night, the fire died down to embers. Clara sat on the rug, sorting seeds for the replanting. Nate sat on a stool near the door, sharpening his knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shh of the stone against steel was hypnotic. Clara watched his hands. They were large, scarred hands, capable of violence. Yet she had seen them cradle a baby bird and sift poisoned earth with infinite patience. "Your hand," Clara said. "It is bleeding." Nate looked down. A blister on his palm, raw from the axe handle, had burst and reopened. He had not made a sound. "It is nothing," he said. "It is not nothing," Clara said firmly. She stood up and fetched the basin of warm water and a strip of clean linen. "Give it to me." Nate hesitated, then held out his hand. Clara knelt before him. She took his hand in hers. The contrast was stark her pale, smaller hand against his dark, weathered skin. She cleaned the wound with a cloth dipped in witch hazel. The sting must have been sharp, but Nate's hand did not twitch. She wrapped the linen around his palm, tying it efficiently. She did not let go immediately. She felt the pulse in his wrist, steady and strong. The heat of him seemed to radiate into the cool room. She looked up. Nate was watching her. His eyes were dark pools, reflecting the dying firelight. The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer the tension of survival. It was the tension of awareness. It was the realization that they were a man and a woman, alone in the vastness of the frontier, bound by a shared trauma. "Nate," Clara said softly. It was the first time she had used his English name without the title of his tribe. "Clara," he replied. She took a breath, steeling herself. "That morning, when I stood in the dirt, when I said, 'Take me instead,'" Nate went still. "You were afraid. You were saving your father." "I was desperate," Clara corrected. I was terrified. I thought I had to sell myself to buy his life. I thought that was all I was worth. She tightened her grip on his hand slightly. But I am not that girl anymore. We have shoveled the salt together. We have stood against the mob. I do not live in desperation anymore. Nate looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened. I know this. So, Clara continued, her voice steady, if I ever say those words again, or if I ever offer myself, it will not be a trade. It will not be a bargain for safety. It will be because I choose it. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotion. It was a declaration of independence, and yet it was an invitation. She was drawing a line in the sand, not to keep him out, but to show him the gate. Nate turned his hand over, clasping hers. His grip was warm and firm. I do not trade in women. Nate repeated the words he had said that first day, but the tone was different now. It was gentle. And I do not accept gifts that are given in fear. I only want what is given freely. He released her hand slowly. You are free. Clara Dunn, you owe me nothing. I know, Clara whispered. That is why it matters. The next morning brought a heavy sky. The clouds were bruised purple, low and menacing. The air smelled of ozone. Storm, Nate said, looking north. A bad one. Before noon, the heavens opened. It was not a gentle spring shower. It was a deluge. The rain fell in sheets, hammering the roof, turning the yard into a quagmire. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. The barn! Clara shouted over the roar of the rain. The roof is weak on the west side. If it goes, we will lose the mule and the cow. They ran out into the storm. The rain soaked them instantly, plastering their clothes to their bodies. The wind was ferocious, tearing at the shingles. Inside the barn, the animals were panicking. The mule was kicking its stall, and the cow was lowing in terror. Water was pouring through a gap in the roof, flooding the stalls. We have to brace it, Nate yelled. He grabbed a heavy timber beam from the corner. It was too heavy for one man to lift into place against the buckling wall. Together, Nate shouted. Clara grabbed the other end. She gritted her teeth, digging her boots into the straw and mud. Lift! They heaved the timber up. Clara's muscles screamed. She felt her strength failing, her knees buckling. Hold it! Nate roared, his own face contorted with effort. Push! Clara, push! She found a reserve of strength she didn't know she had. She pushed, driving the beam upward until it wedged under the sagging crossbeam. Nate hammered it into place with a mallet. The roof groaned, then held. They collapsed onto the hay bales, gasping for breath, water dripping from their faces. They were shivering, wet and exhausted, but they were alive. The animals settled, sensing the danger had passed. Nate looked at Clara. Her hair was plastered to her skull, her dress ruined, her chest heaving. He thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He reached into his belt and pulled out something. It was not a weapon. It was a knife, but not a fighting knife. It was a tool, the handle carved from deer antler, smoothed and shaped to fit a smaller hand. The blade was short, practical, and razor sharp. For you, Nate said, handing it to her. Clara took it. It felt warm from his body. She gripped the handle. It fit her palm perfectly. I made it last night, Nate said, for cutting rope, for skinning, for work. It was a gift of survival. It was his way of saying he saw her not as a damsel, but as a partner. He was arming her, not protecting her. Clara reached into her pocket. She pulled out a length of fabric. It was a ribbon, embroidered with blue thread in a pattern of wildflowers. It was something her mother had made years ago, one of the few pretty things Clara had kept. She reached out and tied it around the leather sheath of Nate's own knife. For you, she said. So you remember that not everything has to be sharp. Some things can just be beautiful. Nate touched the ribbon. In the grim reality of his life, beauty was a luxury he rarely afforded himself. He looked at her, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. The rain is stopping, he said, his voice rough. They walked back to the house as the clouds broke. The sun came out, illuminating a world washed clean. The salt on the bad acre was still there, but the rain had diluted it, washing some of the poison away. The grass on the riverbank was a brilliant, impossible green. Nate stopped on the porch. He did not go inside. "We need to speak of the water," Nate said. "The summer comes, the river will drop again." "I know," Clara said. "We cannot fight every time the sun gets hot." "The fence," Nate said, pointing to the rebuilt rails. "It is a wall. Walls make enemies. We need a gate." He picked up a stick and drew in the mud of the yard. "Here." Nate indicated a spot on the southern edge of the property, away from the house and the garden. "We make a path, a corridor, 10 feet wide, fenced on both sides so the horses do not eat your corn. It leads straight to the deep water. An easement." Clara nodded. "Legal access? We use it only when the moon is full and new." Nate proposed. "Twice a month, we bring the herd. We water, we leave. We do not camp. We do not hunt on your land." "And in return?" Clara asked. "In return," Nate said. "The Comanche watch the northern ridge. No riders from the town will cross that line. We protect the flank." It was a simple, pragmatic solution. It acknowledged the property rights of the white man and the survival needs of the tribe. It was a compromise born of necessity, but sealed with honor. "I agree," Clara said. "We need paper," Nate said, surprising her. "Not for me, for the sheriff, for the men who will come after Crow. They need to see ink." "I will write it," Clara said, "and my father will sign it." That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The storm had cleared the air in more ways than one. Jeremiah sat at the table. He looked at the document Clara had written out. It was simple, stating the terms of the easement. Jeremiah looked at the pen. His hand still shook, but less than before. "Nate!" Jeremiah called out. Nate stepped forward from the shadows. Jeremiah did not look at the paper. He looked at the man. He looked at the ribbon tied to Nate's knife sheath. He looked at the way Nate stood, respectful but unbowed. "You saved my girl," Jeremiah said. "You saved my house. You saved my life." "I did what was necessary," Nate replied. "No." Jeremiah shook his head. "Necessary is shooting a lame horse. What you did, that was something else." Jeremiah pushed the paper aside. "The paper is for the lawyers," the old man said. "I don't read well anyway." He stood up, bracing himself on the table. He extended his hand. It was a gnarled, trembling hand, spotted with age. "I give you the right," Jeremiah said clearly. "Not because of the law, but because I trust you to keep your word." Nate looked at the hand. In the culture of the plains, a man's word was his life. To break it was to die. For a white settler, a man who had hated Indians for 30 years, to offer his hand and his trust was a mountain moving. Nate reached out. He gripped Jeremiah's hand. "You have my word," Nate said. "The water is shared. The land is safe." They shook hands. It was a brief, firm contact. "Good." Jeremiah sat back down, exhausted but satisfied. "Now, Clara, bring me some coffee, and give the man a cup. He looks like he's been drowned in a creek." Clara smiled. She poured the coffee. She handed the cup to Nate. Their fingers brushed again, and the spark was still there, steady and warm. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the healing land. The fence was mended, but a gate was being planned. The salt was fading, and in the silence of the frontier, 2 enemies had found a way to be neighbors, and 2 lonely people had found a way to be something more. The falling action was over. The pieces had settled. All that remained was to see if the future could grow in the soil they had prepared. The seasons turned, as they always did on the high plains, indifferent to the dramas of men but faithful to the rhythm of the earth. The winter that followed the salt and the fire was hard, but it was honest. It brought snow that covered the black scars of the burned granary and leached the poison deep into the soil, diluting it until the earth could breathe again. And then came the spring. 1 year had passed since the day Nate stood between the mob and the river. The Bermejo River flowed strong and clear, fed by the meltwater from the distant peaks. The banks were lush with new growth, the blue-stem grass rising waist-high, waving in the wind like an emerald sea. The scar on the best acre remained, a patch of ground where the corn grew shorter and thinner than the rest, but it was greening over. It was no longer a wound. It was a memory. It served as a reminder that the land was fragile and that it required defense. The town of Dust Creek had changed too. The fear that Silas Crow had manufactured had evaporated when the truth came out. Crow was gone, awaiting trial in a federal penitentiary 300 miles away. The riders who had terrorized the valley had scattered like cockroaches when the light was turned on, without the constant whisper of poison in their ears. The townspeople found that their hatred of the Comanche was not as deep as their respect for a man who kept his word. Clara Dunn stood on the porch of the homestead. The house had been repaired. The roof was sound, and a fresh coat of whitewash made it gleam against the blue sky. But the biggest change was down by the road, where the old fence had been burned. Clara had built a small lean-to structure with a sturdy counter. A sign, painted in neat black letters, hung from the eaves: Dunn's Crossing, freshwater cornbread. A wagon stopped there now. A family of settlers, heading west toward New Mexico, looked dusty and tired. Clara was handing a woman a basket of warm cornbread wrapped in cloth, while a man watered his horses at the trough Nate had built. "Thank you, ma'am," the traveler said, wiping his brow. "We heard in town that this was a safe place to stop." "It is safe," Clara said, smiling. "The water is free. The bread is 5 cents. The man paid her. Clara took the nickel not because she was desperate, but because it was the fruit of her labor. Sitting on a bench nearby were 2 children from the neighboring farm. They were holding slate boards. Clara walked over to them, wiping flour from her hands. "Show me," she said gently. The older boy held up his slate. On it, written in chalk, was the word River. "Good," Clara said, nodding. "Now, what does the river do?" "It gives life," the boy recited, looking at the water flowing behind the house. "And it belongs to the one who cares for it," Clara added. This was her victory. She was not just holding the land. She was planting seeds in the minds of the next generation. She was teaching them that the frontier was not a place to be conquered with guns, but a place to be lived in with understanding. Jeremiah Dunn watched from his chair under the willow tree. He was older now, his hair completely white, and he walked with 2 canes instead of 1. His heart was still a fragile thing, ticking quietly in his chest, but the fear that had once constricted it was gone. He looked toward the south ridge. A group of riders appeared on the horizon. They were Comanche. A year ago, Jeremiah would have reached for his rifle. Now, he simply lifted his hand in greeting. Nate rode at the front. He was not wearing war paint. He wore a clean shirt of calico cloth, though he still kept his buckskin leggings and the knife Clara had given him. He rode the gray pony, which looked sleek and well-fed. Behind him were 4 young warriors, leading a string of horses. They rode down the designated path, the easement. It was a corridor fenced on both sides, 10 feet wide, leading straight to the deep water of the bend. Nate stopped his horse by the willow tree. He dismounted and walked over to Jeremiah. "The grass is high, Greyhawk." Jeremiah said, "It is a good season." Nate replied, "The herd is fat." "My daughter made coffee," Jeremiah said, gesturing to the house. "Strong enough to float a horseshoe?" Nate smiled. It was a rare expression, but it reached his eyes now. He had found a balance. The tribe did not fully understand his life at the homestead, but the chief respected the results. The horses were watered. The soldiers did not come. And Nate, the man they called a bridge walker, had secured their survival without spilling blood. Nate walked up to the house. Clara was waiting for him. They did not embrace wildly. Their love was not a thing of grand gestures and public displays. It was a quiet, steady flame, like the coal in a hearth that keeps the winter at bay. "The fence holds," Nate said, looking at the easement. "I checked the posts this morning." Clara replied, "The cattle are on their side." Your horses are on yours. Our horses, Nate corrected gently. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. Our horses. They stood together, watching the young warriors water the animals. There was no tension. There was only the peaceful sound of water and the wind in the cottonwoods. The circuit judge is coming next week, Clara said, her voice becoming serious. To finalize the deed transfer, my father has signed the land to me, and I have drawn up the paper for the tribe. It grants the easement in perpetuity, as long as the peace is kept. Paper, Nate said, shaking his head slightly. You white people love your paper. It protects us, Clara said. It means that even if the sheriff changes, or if Crow comes back, the law says this path is yours. The paper is good, Nate conceded. But the water is better. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stone. It was a piece of turquoise, polished smooth by the river. I found this upstream, Nate said. It is the color of the sky after the rain. He handed it to her. It was not a diamond ring. It was a piece of the earth they both loved. It is beautiful, Clara said. There is something else, Nate said. He looked toward the willow tree, then back at her. The elders ask why I spend my nights watching your house when there are no wolves. Clara raised an eyebrow. And what do you tell them? I tell them I watch the house because the woman inside holds my spirit, Nate said. His voice was steady, factual. I tell them I am no longer a warrior of the plains only. I am a man of this valley. He took a step closer. We should make it true. Clara, before the spirits and before your God. It was a proposal. It was practical, honest, and terrifyingly romantic in its simplicity. The wedding took place 3 days later. At sunset. It was not a spectacle. There were no guests from the city, no silk gowns. They stood under the weeping willow, near the grave of Clara's mother. The doctor from town stood on one side, holding a Bible. The Comanche chief, an old man wrapped in a red blanket, stood on the other, holding a feathered staff. Clara wore her best dress, the blue one, with the ribbon Nate had admired woven into her hair. Nate wore his ceremonial buckskins, cleaned and beaded, with the knife Clara had given him at his belt. Jeremiah sat in his chair, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Sheriff Holt stood in the back, hat in hand, a silent witness to the peace he had helped preserve. The doctor read a psalm about the rivers of Babylon. The chief spoke a prayer to the four winds, asking for strength and fertility. Then they turned to each other. I do not take you to possess you, Nate said, speaking in English so every witness could hear. I take you to walk beside you. I promise to keep the fire lit. I promise to keep the water clear. I do not take you to save me, Clara said, her voice clear and strong. I take you because I choose you. I promise to mend what is broken. I promise to stand at the gate. They did not exchange rings. Nate tied a leather cord around Clara's wrist, and she tied a strip of blue cloth around his. It was done. 2 worlds, 2 laws, 2 hearts, bound together by the river that flowed beside them. But the frontier was not a fairy tale. It was a place where peace had to be defended every day. 2 weeks after the ceremony, a man rode into the roadside stop. He was a drifter, his clothes ragged, his eyes shifting and nervous. He asked for water. Clara was alone at the stand. Nate was in the field, checking the corn. As Clara poured the water, she looked at the man's boots. They were old and worn, but she recognized the spur straps. They were silver, engraved with a pattern of snakes. She froze. She remembered those spurs. She had seen them flashing in the firelight the night the granary burned. This man had been one of Crow's inner circle, the one who had thrown the torch. The man saw her recognition. He sneered, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. You are the squaw lover, the man spat. Crow is in a cage because of you. Before Clara could reach for the rifle under the counter, a shadow fell over the man. Nate had returned. He had moved with the silence of the wind. He did not shout. He simply grabbed the man's wrist before the pistol cleared the holster. There was a sickening crunch as Nate squeezed. The man howled, dropping the gun. Nate dragged him off the horse. He threw him into the dust. The anger that Nate had suppressed for a year, the rage at the burning, the poisoning, the insults, boiled over. He saw the face of the man who had tried to starve them. Nate drew his knife. The blade gleamed in the sun. He pinned the man to the ground, the tip of the knife pressing against the man's throat. "You burn the food," Nate growled, his eyes black with fury. "You tried to kill the old man. Now you pay." The drifter whimpered, his eyes bulging with terror. He was going to die. Nate was going to cut his throat right there in the road. "Nate!" Clara shouted. Nate did not stop. His muscle memory was screaming for blood. This was justice. This was the law of the wild. Clara ran from behind the counter. She did not grab his arm. She did not try to physically stop him. She knew she couldn't. She dropped to her knees in the dust beside them. She leaned in close until her face was inches from his. "Just spare him," she whispered. Nate froze. The words hung in the air, echoing the first time she had said them, but the meaning had changed. A year ago, she had said it as a desperate plea to save her father from a perceived monster. She had begged him not to be the savage the world thought he was. Now, she was saying it to remind him of the man he had become. "Look at me," Clara said, her voice steady. "We are not them. We do not scorch the earth. We do not kill out of hate." Nate looked at her. He saw the woman who had shoveled salt with him. He saw the woman who had built a school for the children. He saw his wife. He looked at the trembling coward beneath him. To kill him would be easy, but to kill him would be to let Silas Crow win. It would prove that violence was the only language the land understood. Nate took a deep breath. He pulled the knife back. He stood up, sheathing the blade. "Get up," Nate said to the man. The drifter scrambled to his feet, clutching his throat. "Ride," Nate commanded. "Tell the others. The fire is out. If you come back, the law will take you, not the knife, the law." The man scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the dust. Nate stood trembling, the adrenaline fading. He felt a hand on his arm. "You are a good man, Greyhawk," Clara said softly. Nate looked at her. "I wanted to kill him." "I know," Clara said, "but you didn't. That is the difference." They walked back to the house together as the sun began to set. The years that followed were kind to the valley. The rains came on time. The corn grew tall and sweet. The easement became a well-worn path, a symbol of a peace that held against the odds. Jeremiah Dunn lived to see his grandson born. He died in his sleep one winter night, the sound of the wind in the chimney lulling him to rest. They buried him beside his wife, under the willow tree. Nate and Clara grew old on the land. They worked it every day. They did not conquer it. They partnered with it. The town of Dust Creek eventually became a stop on the main line, but the Dunn homestead remained a sanctuary. Travelers would tell stories of the Indian who quoted the law and the white woman who spoke Comanche. One evening, many years later, Nate and Clara sat on the porch. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in the same violent oranges and purples as the day they met. Clara looked out at the field. The scar of the salt was gone completely now, covered by a sea of alfalfa. "It is ours," Clara said. Nate shook his head. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, the leather cord and the blue ribbon long since replaced by wrinkles and scars. "No," Nate said. "We are it." He looked at the river, flowing endlessly toward the sea. "The land does not belong to the man with the paper," Nate said, his voice raspy with age but still strong. "It does not belong to the man with the gun. It belongs to the one who stays when the water is low. It belongs to the one who plants the seed and watches it grow." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "We stayed," she said. "We stayed," Nate agreed. They sat in silence as the stars came out. Two specks of life in the vastness of the West, bound not by chains, but by the freedom of their choice. They had not just survived the frontier, they had defined it. They had proven that the strongest thing in the world was not a locomotive or a cavalry charge. It was a promise kept. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Nate and Clara touched your heart as much as it did mine writing it. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I am always amazed to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support keeps the campfire burning. Thank you. And until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.